Mission is a go.
There's a moment, a fraction of a second, that lives between a raised hand and a broken arm. In that sliver of time, an entire military career can end. A reputation built over decades can collapse like a tent in a storm. And a woman who was never supposed to matter, never supposed to speak, never supposed to fight back, can become the most talked about soldier in the country. This is not a story about anger. It is a story about a woman who had been quiet for so long that when she finally moved, nobody, not even she, was ready for what happened next. Her name was Captain Aisha Raza. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. She had never once raised her voice in a briefing room. She filed her reports on time, kept her uniform pressed, and said yes, sir, so cleanly and so often that the men around her had long since made the mistake of confusing her discipline for submission. Colonel Haroon Beg had made that mistake loudly, proudly, and in front of 800 people. He would spend the next 6 months eating his meals through a straw and explaining to a military tribunal exactly how it happened. The morning it all broke open, the sky over the base was the color of old iron. Clouds sat low and heavy, the kind that don't rain, they just press. 800 troops stood in formation on the parade ground, boots aligned, chins up, rifles at their sides. It was a routine inspection ceremony. It was the kind of event where nothing ever happens. Until it did. Until a colonel walked up to a captain in front of everyone she had ever served with, lifted his hand, and discovered, too late, that she had been waiting every single day of her 12-year career for exactly this moment. What followed lasted 4 seconds. What followed lasted the rest of both their lives. Sit down. Take a breath. Because this story does not move the way you think it will. It does not begin with the snap of bone. It begins years earlier, in a household where a girl was taught that being small meant being safe, and it ends on a parade ground where she proved that everything she had ever been taught was wrong. This is the story of Captain Aisha Raza. Every word of it is true. Aisha Raza was born in a house where the walls knew how to keep secrets. It was a narrow, 2-story building in Rawalpindi, the kind of house that smelled like cumin and old would no matter the season, the kind where the rooms were small enough that every argument, every whispered prayer, every late-night argument between her parents pressed through the walls and found her in her bed whether she invited it or not. She was the second of 4 children. She was the only daughter. And in that house, on that street, in that city, being the only daughter meant something very specific. It meant you were managed. It meant decisions were made on your behalf by people who genuinely believed they were protecting you, and who would have been genuinely confused if you had tried to explain what the protection actually felt like from the inside. Her father, Brigadier Khalid Raza, was not a cruel man. This is important to say plainly and early because the story of Aisha is not a story about monsters. It is a story about systems. It is a story about how ordinary men, decent men, men who pray 5 times a day and remember their mother's birthdays, can build cages out of the best intentions they own. Khalid Raza loved his daughter. He was also so thoroughly convinced that the world was dangerous for women that he had spent her entire childhood making the world small enough to control. She did not go to school by bus. She did not stay late for extracurriculars. She did not have friends who were boys, or if she did not have them for long. Every boundary he drew was drawn with love. Every fence was installed with the specific goal of keeping harm out. What he did not consider was what it felt like to grow up inside a fence. What he did not consider was who she would become when she finally climbed over it. Aisha was 12 when she first saw a woman in uniform. It was a documentary on the national broadcaster, the kind of program that ran on Sunday afternoons when the men in the house were asleep and she had the television to herself. The woman on screen was a medical officer in the Pakistani army, standing at the edge of a field hospital in the north. She was not beautiful in any way that her father would have categorized as beauty. She was sun-dark and square-shouldered, and her hair was pulled back so severely it stretched the skin at her temples. She was giving instructions to 3 male soldiers, and not one of them looked at her, as though her instructions were optional. Aisha watched that woman for 9 minutes. She did not tell anyone what she had felt. She filed it away in the part of herself she had learned early to keep private. The years that followed were the years of becoming what she was expected to become. She was good at school, sharp at mathematics, sharper at languages, possessed of the kind of quiet intelligence that gets called diligence by teachers who do not want to admit they are watching someone exceptional. She sat examinations. She scored well. She smiled when she was told to smile, and she said yes when yes was required, and she learned, in the way that only daughters learn, the exact temperature at which the atmosphere in a room turns dangerous. She could feel a shift in her father's mood the way other people feel weather coming. She could navigate an argument before it started. She could make herself smaller than she was, flatter than she was, less than she was, and she was so good at it for so long that she almost forgot it was a skill and not just a fact of her nature. She was 19 when she took the entrance examination for the Pakistan Military Academy. She did not tell her father she was going to do it. She took a rickshaw to the examination center, paid for it with money she had saved over 14 months from the birthday envelopes her aunts pressed in her hands, and she sat in a room full of young men and one other woman, and she worked through every question with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had been preparing for this without knowing it her entire life. When the results came, she had ranked in the top 8%. She opened the letter alone in the kitchen at 7 in the morning while her parents slept. Then she went upstairs and she told her father. What happened next in that room is not something she has ever described in detail to anyone. What is known is that the conversation lasted 3 hours. What is known is that her mother sat at the kitchen table throughout and did not speak. What is known is that by the end of it, Khalid Raza had agreed to something he had never once imagined agreeing to in his life, and that Aisha had walked out of that room with her acceptance standing and her relationship with her father permanently reorganized around a fact he had not previously been required to absorb. His daughter was going to go, and he was not going to stop her. She arrived at PMA Kakul on a morning in late September. The mountains behind the academy were the color of the inside of a bruise, purple-gray and enormous, and the air was cold in a way that city air never is, clean and sharp like something that had not yet been breathed enough to soften. She stood at the gate with her bag, and she looked at the buildings and the parade ground and the flagpole, and she felt something she would spend years trying to name accurately. It was not happiness. It was not relief. It was closer to the sensation of hearing a word in a language you didn't know you spoke, a word that named something you had felt your whole life without having the vocabulary for it. She was home, not in a soft sense, not in the sense of comfort or familiarity. Home in the sense of, this is where the thing I actually am belongs. Home in the sense of, everything before this was preparation, and now the preparation is over. Training at Kakul was not easy for anyone. Training at Kakul was especially not easy for the women, who were fewer, who were watched differently, who had to navigate not just the physical difficulty, but the constant ambient pressure of being in a space that had been built without them in mind, and that had not yet fully decided how to feel about their presence. Some of the male cadets were fine. Some were not. Some of the instructors treated the women with clinical even-handedness. Some treated them with a slightly more lenient standard that was its own kind of condescension, the general implication that the bar had been lowered out of mercy, that they were being accommodated rather than assessed. And some, a small number but present, always present, treated them with the specific cold contempt that men reserve for women who are doing things men believe women should not do. Aisha Raza moved through all of it with the same expression she had worn in her father's house. Contained, correct, impossible to read. She did not complain. She did not make a scene. She did not go to her female bunkmates at night and process her feelings about the unfairness of it, though the unfairness was real and she felt it. She performed. She outperformed. She ran faster than she had been told women ran. She scored higher than people had collectively assumed she would score. She learned to shoot with the focused patience of someone who had spent years learning to sit very still in rooms that made her uncomfortable, and it turned out that skill translated precisely. Her final year evaluation placed her 6th overall in her cohort. There were 240 cadets in that cohort. She graduated in a ceremony her father attended. He sat in the stands in a pressed shower camise, and he watched his daughter march across the parade ground in uniform and receive her commission, and when she looked up into the stand, she found his face, and he was crying, which she had not expected, which she would think about for years afterward. The fact that it had taken this particular display of competence in this particular arena to produce that particular emotion in him. Not the examination results. Not the 3 hours in the kitchen. Not the years of being good and obedient and contained. This, a uniform, a commission, the institution's seal. She filed that away too. The first 5 years of her career were the years of learning the second curriculum. The one nobody writes down, the one that exists in the space between official policy and actual behavior, the one that teaches you which rooms you are welcome in and which ones you enter at the cost of something. She moved through postings in Lahore, then Quetta, then a 6-month attachment near the line of control that aged her in ways she could not explain to people who hadn't been there. She was good at her job, consistently, methodically, unshowily good. She wrote reports that were precise and ahead of deadline. She managed her unit with the kind of even authority that her senior officers noted in her evaluations as reliable and composed. 2 words that she came to understand were the words used when they meant to say something they didn't quite have the vocabulary for yet. She was 31 when she was posted to the base at Carrion. Colonel Haroon Beg had been commanding there for 3 years. The first time she saw him, he was standing outside the officers' mess, talking to 2 majors, and something about the way he occupied the space, the breadth of his stance, the volume of his voice, the way the 2 majors were positioned slightly behind him as though proximity to the center of gravity was itself a kind of status, told her something she noted and filed and did not yet name. He was 54. He had the look of a man who had been handsome young and had spent the intervening decades becoming imposing instead, the jaw heavier, the eyes harder, all the soft edges of youth calcified into something that had learned to read its own solidity as authority. He had been decorated twice. He had the respect of his men in the way that a difficult terrain has the respect of the people who cross it daily, not because they love it, but because they have learned what it costs to underestimate it. He was not the first commanding officer who had looked at Aisha Raza and seen something that needed to be put in its place. He was just the last one who tried. The first months at Carrion were unremarkable in the way that months before disasters are always unremarkable in hindsight. She did her work. She attended briefings. She filed her reports. She ate in the officers' mess and participated in the institutional rhythms of the base with the practiced naturalness of someone who had been navigating these rhythms for over a decade. Beg, in those early months, treated her with the specific flavor of dismissal that she had long since learned to identify. Not hostility, not contempt, but a kind of administrative invisibility, the treating of her reports as procedural rather than substantive, the routing of decisions around rather than through her, the particular blindness of a man who looks at a woman in a position and sees the position without seeing the person who holds it. She did not escalate. She did not complain. She did what she had always done. She worked harder, performed cleaner, documented everything, and waited. What she was waiting for, she could not have told you precisely, only that she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has spent their entire life reading atmospheres, that the thing she had been waiting for since the moment she had seen that woman on the television screen at 12 years old was not yet over. That whatever she had been building toward, whatever all of it, the fence and the kitchen and the examination and the mountains and the postings and the years of being reliable and composed was still under construction, that there was still something left to do. She did not know it would happen on a parade ground. She did not know 800 people would be watching. She did not know it would take 4 seconds. She only knew, in the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive, that something was building, that Beg was building toward something, that the way he looked at her in briefings, not angry, not openly contemptuous, but measuring the way a man measures a thing he is deciding how to handle, was the look of a man who had decided on a course of action and was simply waiting for the right moment to take it. She watched him the way she had always watched rooms that were about to change temperature. She waited. The morning of the inspection ceremony, she rose at 5. She pressed her uniform herself. She had always pressed it herself, even when orderlies were available, because the act of it was the act of preparation, of telling her hands what the day was going to require of them. She ate breakfast without tasting it. She walked to the parade ground in the iron-colored morning, and she took her place in the formation, and she stood as she had always stood, straight, still, correct, completely present in her body in the way that 12 years of military discipline teaches you to be present, or teaches you to perform presence, so well that the distinction between the two becomes academic. 800 troops stood around her. The sky pressed down. Colonel Haroon Beg walked onto the parade ground, and somewhere in the part of Aisha Raza that had been 12 years old, and watching a woman on a television screen give instructions to men who did not look at her as though her instructions were optional, something went very, very quiet. Not the quiet of submission. The quiet before. The parade ground at Carrion Base was regulation flat. The kind of flat that only exists in military spaces, leveled deliberately, maintained obsessively, a surface that communicates through its own evenness that things here are controlled, that disorder is not tolerated, that the ground itself has been brought to heel. In the early morning, before the sun had done much to the sky, it had the look of gray concrete under gray light under gray clouds, the whole world rendered in a single color, and 800 people stood on it in rows so precise they looked like something printed rather than assembled. Aisha stood in her position, third row from the front, second from the left end of her unit's block. She had stood in positions like this hundreds of times. Morning parades, inspection ceremonies, farewell formations, the whole rhythmic calendar of military life that marks time not in months but in occasions, each occasion with its own choreography, its own protocol, its own understood rules about where you stand and what you do not do under any circumstance. She knew where her eyes were supposed to be directed. She knew the required distance between her right shoulder and the left shoulder of the man beside her. She knew what her hands were supposed to do. She had been doing this for 12 years. Her boots were polished to the regulation standard. Her uniform was, as it always was, impeccable. She did not look at Colonel Begg when he walked on the ground. She looked forward at the middle distance, at nothing specific in the military style of eyes front that is less about what you see and more about what you communicate by the angle of your attention. But she tracked him. She had always been able to track a room without appearing to look at it. Her father's house had given her that, had trained that peripheral awareness into her so thoroughly that by now operated below the level of conscious thought. Just a quiet, constant feed of information about where the difficult thing in a room was and which direction it was moving. Begg moved down the first row. He was accompanied by Major Tariq Hussein, his aide who carried a clipboard, and walked 2 steps back and 1 step to the right with the bearing of a man who has learned to be near the sun without making the mistake of thinking he is warm. Behind them, 2 other officers and a warrant officer maintained the small procession shape. It was the standard formation for an inspection walk. It was unremarkable. It was the ceremony performing itself, the institution in its most visible mode, and 800 people stood and breathed and did not move. Begg was not an erratic inspector. She knew his inspection style from 6 months of observation. He was methodical, precise, critical in the way that inspections are supposed to be critical, finding fault not from spite, but from the genuine belief that standards are maintained by the consistent identification and correction of deviation. He had a way of stopping in front of a soldier and looking at them from boots to cap in a single slow scan that managed to feel both impersonal and penetrating. He issued corrections in a flat, carrying voice, loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough to perform cruelty. He was doing his job. He did it down the first row. He did it through the second. When he reached the third row, Aisha felt the shift in air pressure that she associated with proximity. Not fear, not anxiety, just the body's animal acknowledgement that something relevant was approaching. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her breathing even. Her hands were at her sides, relaxed, in the correct position. Begg stopped in front of her. She had known he would. Not from anything specific. Not from any visible signal. She had known it the way, on the day a difficult thing finally arrives that you have been half expecting it for a long time. Not surprise, but recognition, the feeling of a thing snapping into place. He stood in front of her, and he did the scan, boots to cap, and she did not look at him, which was correct, which was protocol, which was exactly what she was supposed to do, but she felt the scan land on each part of her, and she felt the pause when it reached her face, the pause that was not part of the inspection standard rhythm. He said something. It was quiet enough that only the soldiers immediately adjacent could hear it clearly, though everyone within 20 feet caught the register, if not the words. What he said, and this would later be documented in 3 separate witness statements submitted to the tribunal, was a comment about the way she wore her cap. Specifically, he said that she wore it the way women wore hats at weddings, decoratively, without understanding the function. The soldiers immediately adjacent did not move. Aisha Raza did not move. Her breathing did not change. What changed, and this too would be documented from the perspective of the woman standing to her left, a lieutenant named Sanaa Mir, who had served with Aisha for 4 months and who would later describe what she witnessed with the careful, economical precision of someone who understood that what she was describing was historical, was her eyes. They came off the middle distance, slowly, deliberately, in a way that was nothing like flinching and everything like a decision being made. She looked at Colonel Beg. She said, at a volume the whole third row could hear without straining, "Sir, the cap is within regulation standard. I'd be glad to show you the measurement." It was not defiance in tone. It was not defiance in phrasing. It was the sentence of a person who has read the manual and is offering to produce it. But in the context, in front of 800 soldiers on a parade ground where the protocol was absolute, where a junior officer did not correct a commanding officer, where the script had been written long before either of them arrived on this ground, and the script said she accepted the correction and moved on. In that context, it was the most radical thing she had said in 12 years of service. Beg's face did not change expression in any way that could be clearly read at a distance. Up close, Lieutenant Mir would later say, something moved in it. Something that had been sitting very still became briefly, visibly unsettled, and then settled again, harder than before. He moved on. The inspection continued. Aisha returned her eyes to the middle distance. For the next 40 minutes, the ceremony proceeded exactly as ceremonies at Carrion Base always proceeded. There was the inspection walk. There was the formal address. There was the presentation of a commendation to a sergeant in the engineering unit who had distinguished himself in a training exercise. There was the march past, the units moving in their blocks across the ground with the contained, collective precision that is one of the genuinely impressive things a military institution produces, the transformation of individuals into a single moving body, every footfall calibrated to land in the same instant. Aisha marched with her unit. She did not think about what had happened. She had learned long ago not to think in the middle of things. Thinking in the middle of things got you through the middle of things with your mind somewhere else, and she had always been someone who preferred to be exactly where she was. She marched. She kept the interval. She kept the step. She felt the ground under her boots and the cold air in her lungs and the collective weight of 800 people moving together, and she was present in all of it completely, cleanly. After the march passed, the formation reassembled. The final address, the dismissal, the standard closing protocol that every soldier on that ground had performed dozens of times and could have recited in their sleep. Beg moved back to the front of the formation. She tracked him moving. She tracked him saying the closing words. She tracked the shift, the way the ceremony began to wind toward its conclusion, the slight collective relaxation of 800 bodies that accompanies the moment when an event signals that it is nearly over, when a formal tension begins its controlled release. It is a vulnerability, that moment. Not a dramatic one, just the small human loosening that happens when you believe the difficulty is almost done. She was tracking it when Beg turned, not toward the assembled troops as a whole, toward her specifically, back down the third row, past the first and second positions, stopping again in front of her, and this time his aide was not beside him. This time there was no clipboard. This time it was just him and her, and whatever he had decided in the 40 minutes since she had offered to show him the regulation measurement. She looked at him. He spoke, and this time his voice carried. It carried not because he raised it, but because he projected it, the way career military men project, from the chest, shaped by years of addressing formations, naturally amplified by the flat, open ground and the silence of 800 people who had gone completely still. What he said was an elaboration of the earlier comment. It concerned her presence on the base, generally. It used language that, again, documented in 3 witness statements, was condescending in a way that was almost clinical, almost architectural, the kind of condescension that has been so thoroughly naturalized in a person that they no longer experience it as a choice. He was not furious. He was not red-faced. He was a man who was explaining a fact, and the fact was that she did not belong where she was, and his tone was the tone of a man who has decided that this particular truth needs to be delivered in public in front of everyone, loudly enough that there can be no ambiguity about it afterward. 800 soldiers were very, very still. Aisha Raza stood in front of him and let the words land and did not move. And then he raised his hand. This is the moment that would be replayed in descriptions, in testimony, in newspaper accounts, and WhatsApp voice notes, and television panel discussions, and the conversations of people who had never been near a parade ground in their lives for months afterward. The moment when Colonel Haroon Beg, decorated twice, commanding officer of a base of 800 troops, a man who was 54 years old and had never been challenged in this way in his professional life, lifted his hand. He was not going to punch her. This is worth clarifying, because in the accounts that circulated afterward, the word hit acquired different textures in different retellings, and some of those textures were more dramatic than the reality. What Beg intended, what his body language communicated to Lieutenant Mir and to the 3 other soldiers in the immediate vicinity who would later testify, was a slap. The contemptuous, corrective, almost parental slap of a man who had decided that words were no longer the correct instrument and that a different kind of correction was needed. A slap that said, "You are less than." A slap that said, "This is what your presence here costs you." A slap that said all the things that 12 years of being female in this institution said them in a single, physical, irreversible act. His hand came up. It came toward her face. It did not arrive. What happened in the space between his hand rising and Aisha Raza's response is something that multiple witnesses describe with almost identical language, which is notable because witnesses almost never use identical language, and the consistency of the description suggests they were all watching something so clean, so precise, so contained that it left no room for individual interpretation. She moved, not backward, not sideways, not away. She moved into it. Her left hand caught his wrist, not grab, caught with the targeted accuracy of someone who has been training exactly this motion for years, who knows the geometry of an incoming arm by the position of the shoulder that drives it. Her right hand went to the elbow. What she did then took approximately 2 seconds and required the application of a very specific and very technical kind of force, not strength, exactly, more like geometry, like the precise understanding of where a joint bends and where it does not, and what happens when you apply pressure at the intersection of those 2 facts. The sound. There are sounds that, once heard, do not leave. Not because they are loud. This one was not loud. A dry, short, dense sound. The sound of a system failing at its weakest point. Beg went down on one knee. He did not make a theatrical sound of pain. He made a small, involuntary, very human sound. The sound a body makes when it is ambushed by something it was not expecting, a sound located somewhere between a gasp and a word that never formed. Aisha stepped back. She came to attention. She was breathing normally. Her uniform was, as it had been throughout the morning, impeccable. 800 people were completely silent. In the silence, in the iron-colored morning, on the regulation flat parade ground, a colonel was on one knee holding an arm that was no longer doing what arms are supposed to do, and a captain was standing at attention, looking at a point in the middle distance with the expression of someone who has just finished a task that required their full attention and has now moved on. The silence held for a long time. Then, Major Tariq Hussein dropped his clipboard. The sound of it hitting the concrete was at that moment the loudest thing in the world. And Aisha Raza did not flinch. She had not flinched in 12 years. She was not going to start now. What happened in the immediate aftermath? The rushing of the medical officer, the surrounding of Beg by his aides, the collective exhale of 800 people all remembering at the same moment that they were allowed to breathe, happened around her, and not quite to her. She stood. She waited. She followed the correct protocol for an officer involved in an incident. She did not leave the formation without being dismissed. She did not speak to the other soldiers around her. She waited to be addressed by the next senior officer present. Major Hussein addressed her. He was, she would later note, very pale. He asked her, in a voice that was trying to be authoritative and not quite getting there, whether she was all right. She said, "Yes, sir." He asked her to remain in position. She said, "Yes, sir." She stood in position on the parade ground while the ceremony was formally ended around the fact of what had just happened, while Beg was helped off the ground and escorted off the parade ground with a comprehensively broken arm, while the formation was dismissed in the strangest, quietest, most concentrated dismissal in the history of that base. Soldiers moving away in groups of 2 and 3, heads bent, voices low, everyone processing something that they had not been given any institutional framework for processing, and so we're processing the way humans have always processed things that exceed the available frameworks, by talking to each other quietly and trying to find the edges of it. She stood in position until she was told she could stand down. Then, she walked off the parade ground at the same pace she had walked on it. She did not look back. Behind her from a distance she could not measure and would not have turned to gauge someone she never found out who started clapping. A single pair of hands, slow and deliberate. Then a second. Then a sound like weather. She kept walking. She did not allow herself to name what moved in her chest then. The thing that arrived with the sound of 800 soldiers finding, one by one, in the cold gray morning, something their hands knew how to do with what they had just witnessed. She filed it. She walked back to her quarters. She sat on the edge of her bed. She looked at her hands. They were steady. They had always been steady. She had simply never before been in a situation that required her to show anyone. By noon, the story had left the base. Not officially, not through any authorized channel, not through a press release or a formal statement or any mechanism that the institution would have recognized as a legitimate mode of communication. It left the way things always leave in the age of small, bright screens and thumbs that move faster than policy. Person to person, base to city, city to country, traveling at the speed of disbelief, which is one of the fastest speeds there is. Someone had seen it. Someone had a phone. And then 800 people who had witnessed the same 4 seconds had by the time the lunch hour arrived, each told at least one person who had not been there, and each of those people had told at least one more, and the story, in spreading, had already begun to change shape, not in its essential facts, but in the details around them, the details that different people's minds reach for to make the thing real, to make it legible, to locate it within some story they already knew. In some versions, Baig's arm was broken in multiple places. In some versions, he had been unconscious briefly, which he had not. In some versions, Aisha had said something before she moved, something definitive and quotable, some line that announced itself as a line. She had not said anything. She had just moved. The version that was truest was also the version that, because it lacked a dramatic statement, was hardest to turn into a satisfying shareable paragraph. She had seen a hand coming toward her face, and she had responded to it with 12 years of training and the specific practice technique of someone who had spent every optional physical training session for the past 5 years drilling combative defense rather than maintaining the baseline fitness that was all her position technically required. And then she had stood at attention and waited to be addressed by the senior officer present. That was all. That was enough. In her quarters, in the hour after the parade ground, Aisha did not call anyone. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands for a while, and then she got up and she drank a glass of water, and she ate the lunch she had prepared before the ceremony. Rice and lentils made the previous evening, the kind of meal that does not require attention to eat, and she tried to think clearly about what was going to happen next. She was not under any illusions about what was going to happen next. She had not acted impulsively. This is a thing that needed to be clear to herself before it became a thing she would need to make clear to anyone else. She had not acted from rage, or from panic, or from the kind of in-the-moment combustion that makes a person do something and then spend the subsequent weeks rebuilding a story around it that justifies the doing. She had acted from training, from the clean physical response of a body that knew what to do when a hand came toward its face, and she had done it with precision, and she had done it completely. And if she had had the 100th of a second in which to make a conscious choice, she believed she would have made the same one. She was a soldier. He had raised his hand. She had neutralized the threat. The fact that the threat was her commanding officer was a complication. The fact that it had happened in front of 800 people was a complication. The fact that it would now move through whatever institutional machinery the military deployed for situations of this kind was not just a complication. It was the entire second story, the one that would begin now, and that would be in its way harder than the 12 years that had preceded it, harder even than the 4 seconds on the parade ground, because the parade ground had required only her body, and it had lasted 4 seconds, and what was coming now would require everything else she had, and it would last considerably longer. She put the lunch things in the sink. She sat back down. She thought about her father. She thought about the house in Rawalpindi, the walls that kept secrets, the kitchen where she had told him, and he had cried at the ceremony rather than at the conversation, and she tried to understand what she felt about the fact that he would almost certainly hear about this. The military grapevine is not a rumor network so much as a nervous system. Information moves through it at the speed of the anxiety it generates, and a decorated colonel with a broken arm and a story this shape would generate considerable anxiety. Her father would hear. He would hear a version, probably several versions. He would call. She was not, she found, afraid of that call. That was new. She had been afraid of her father's reactions for most of her life. Not in an acute, physical way, but in the diffuse, chronic way of a person who has spent years calibrating their choices around another person's anticipated responses, who has learned to run everything through the internal simulator that asks what this will cost, what this will require, what this will mean for the relationship that, for better and worse, has been the primary gravitational force in her life. She ran it now and found that the simulator was not returning results. Not because it had broken, but because she had given it something it could not process, an action that she did not regret, that she would not take back, that she had done with her entire self, and that had cost her something she did not yet know the full price of, and she had done it anyway. The simulator was designed for trade-offs. It was useless in the presence of something that had not been a choice in the calculating sense, but in the total sense, the kind of decision that is not made in the moment but is rather revealed by the moment, the kind that shows you something about yourself that was always true and just needed the right conditions to become visible. She had spent 12 years becoming the best soldier she could be. She had spent 12 years doing it in a system that looked at her and saw first and always and continuously a woman, and had structured every interaction around that primary categorization in ways both gross and subtle, both intentional and entirely unconscious, both cruel and kind in the specific way that condescension can be kind, the kindness of lowered expectations, the generosity of adjusted standards, the warm benevolence of being told you are doing very well for someone like you. She had absorbed it. She had filed it. She had waited. She did not know, sitting on the edge of her bed in the Carrion Base officer's quarters with the gray sky pressing on the window, whether what she had done that morning was the thing she had been waiting for or simply the most visible of the many things she had done every day for 12 years. Whether the breaking of Beg's arm was the moment of the story, or whether it was just the moment that other people could see, the one legible instant in a 12-year performance that had been equally extraordinary and almost entirely invisible. She was still sitting with that when there was a knock at her door. Major Hussein. He was still pale. He had been joined, she saw when she opened the door, by Major Fatima Khalil, the base's female welfare officer, who was technically her point of contact for exactly these kinds of incidents, who had the careful, steady face of a person who was prepared for a conversation and is now doing the thing they prepared for. Behind them, slightly back, a man she recognized as a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General's Corps, whose presence told her everything she needed to know about the official posture the institution had already adopted toward the morning's events. She stood aside and let them in. She made tea. This was noted afterward by Major Hussein in the context of trying to explain what Aisha Raza was like, what quality she possessed that made the morning both comprehensible and extraordinary. He said, in the informal debrief he gave to a colleague weeks later, she made tea while a JAG officer sat in her room, and she handed it to us, and she sat down, and she was completely calm. Not the calm of someone who doesn't understand what is happening. The other kind. The kind that knows exactly what is happening and has decided to be inside it fully rather than trying to get away from it. The JAG officer's name was Major Arif Saleri. He was 39, the kind of lean and precise that legal work does to certain kinds of people, and he had a voice that moved carefully, the way someone moves carefully in a room they have not memorized yet. He had a recording device. He explained that this was to ensure accuracy. He asked if she consented to the recording. She said yes. He asked her to describe, in her own words, the events of the morning. She described them, clearly, sequentially, without editorializing, without the kind of emotional framing that people apply to their own accounts when they're trying to be believed rather than when they're simply trying to be accurate. She described what Beg had said during the first pass. She described his return. She described what he had said in the second approach. She described the raising of his hand and her response to it. She used the technical terminology for the defense technique she had employed, a joint lock applied to the elbow and wrist standard combative curriculum, a technique she had drilled in the base gym. She could provide the dates and times of training sessions if that would be useful. Major Saleri looked at her. She looked back. He asked if she had intended to injure Colonel Beg. She said she had intended to stop the incoming strike. The injury was a result of the force required to do so. He asked if she had considered alternative responses. She said, with the same flat accuracy she had maintained throughout, she had considered stepping back. She had determined, in the time available, that stepping back would not be sufficient to avoid contact. She had therefore moved forward. There was a pause. He made a note. Major Fatima Khalil asked, gently, whether Aisha was all right. Aisha said yes. Fatima asked whether she wanted to say anything about the context, about the comments made during the inspection, about the preceding months of her posting at Carrion, about anything she believed was relevant to the tribunal that would now be convened to examine the incident. Aisha looked at her. She said, I have kept detailed records since my arrival at this base. I can provide them. Fatima went very still. Solari's pen stopped moving. The records. This was the thing that no one had anticipated, that none of the people in that room, or in the larger institutional architecture now assembling itself around the morning's events, had considered in their first hours of response. Beg's arm was the visible thing. The spectacle of a captain breaking a colonel's arm in front of 800 troops was the thing that had exited the base on 1,000 phones and was now accelerating through the national conversation at the speed of disbelief. But Aisha Raza had spent 6 months at Carrion Base, and she had done what she had always done. She had documented dates, times, nature of comment or incident, witness present, her own response, file number, methodically, on her personal device, backed up in 3 places, maintained with the same precise attention she brought to every other professional document she produced. 12 months of records, not just from Carrion, from every posting, because she had always known, somewhere in the part of herself she kept private and had never shown anyone, that the thing she had been waiting for would require evidence, would require not just the experience of what had happened, but the ability to demonstrate it, to remove it from the realm of her word against theirs and place it in the realm of documented fact. She had never told anyone she was keeping the records. She had never given anyone reason to know they were being documented. She had kept them simply, consistently, without drama, for most of her 12 years of service. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Solari asked carefully how many incidents were recorded. She told him. He put down his pen. He picked it up again. He wrote something. Major Hussein, who had been sitting in the corner and had not spoken since he sat down, made a sound that was not quite a word. Outside the window, the sky was still the same iron color it had been all morning. The clouds had not broken. The cold was the same cold. The base continued its afternoon. The kitchens working, the vehicle depot running, the administrative buildings processing the paperwork of 800 lives, all of it continuing in the way institutions continue even when something has ruptured inside them, because institutions are very good at maintaining their surface while their interior reorganizes around a new fact. The new fact was sitting in a chair in her officer's quarters, drinking tea, with 12 years of evidence on a backed-up device, and a broken-arm colonel at the base hospital, and 800 witnesses, and the specific, complete, unassailable calm of a woman who had been preparing in every way she knew how to prepare for exactly this moment. Not for the breaking of the arm, for what came after it, for the room where she would have to be not just brave, but credible, not just right, but documented, not just wronged, but provably, systematically, undeniably wronged in ways that no institutional process could look at and find ambiguous. Major Solari asked if she would be willing to formally provide the records. She said, I plan to. He looked at her again. She looked back. Outside, far away from that room, the story was still traveling. Voice note to voice note, screen to screen, person to person across a country that had opinions about women in the military and opinions about officers who raised their hands and opinions about what respect meant and what power meant and who was entitled to which. The story was already being used by people with positions to confirm and arguments to win, and it was already changing shape in their hands, becoming the story of their argument rather than the story of her life. But the story of her life was here, in this room, in a chair, drinking tea, with 12 years of records and 2 still hands and the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally, in this gray afternoon, in this small room in this base that was not built for her, been given somewhere to put it down.